Chief Day's leadership has been instrumental in fostering a culture of accountability, transparency, and mutual respect within the Bureau. He has spearheaded numerous initiatives aimed at improving public safety, strengthening community police relationships, and advancing modern policing practices.
Having sat out for almost 4.5 years and watched the city struggle in many areas that I had given so many years of service, and my decision to come back and my decision to even sit here tonight is based simply upon my passion and my love for the profession and for the city. I appreciate your consideration.
I believe that for such a time as this, that Chief Day is the man for the job. And I would encourage him, if he will, to take in consideration to bring more SROs into the school building. Thank you for this time, and thank you, Chief Bob Day.
Our new Latino consul and my engagement with many chiefs and officers since 2020 allowed me to say with this confidence and that Portland Police Bureau continues to show up with our community, and Chief Day and his officers show up to listen, to learn, and to work with our consul and our community on addressing community safety in a way that is actually community-led and driving.
People in my community, as you know, haven't always had a good relationship with the Police Bureau. But I can say that he's a person who has worked diligently to make sure that he does his part, and those that work for him to make sure that they're doing their part to bridge the gap between police and community, and that literally over time we all become community.
Okay, so I'm Charlie Michelle Wesley, tribal member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde on this, our sacred land. I need to take a minute to honor T-Rex and Dog, who paid the ultimate price for justice, for Black lives, and for real police accountability. What are you going to do to acknowledge that white supremacy cannot have a foothold in the Portland Police Department? Because what I saw in the very first City Council meeting was really concerning.
What keeps you up at night as police chief?
I really believe that Portland is poised at a time of resurgence, that it saddens me as I have traveled around the country and I hear the criticism of the perspective or the perception of Portland. So what keeps me up at night is the risk that we will squander the time that we're seeing where Portlanders are coming together alongside of law enforcement, which has not always been the case, but really holistically as a community. And what lies ahead, I think, is incredibly more opportunistic and exciting than maybe even what we've seen in the 3 decades I served before. Last week, on a snow day, we swore in 10 new police officers, and 2 were white males and 2 were females and 6 were people of color.
I like you as a human. I've really appreciated working with you. I think you are very honest, and I appreciate your efforts to be transparent. So there is a nominating committee that will be evaluating applicants for the new charter-required Community Board for Police Accountability. This nominating committee includes 3 police officers, one of which is going to be appointed by the Chief of Police. So how will you be deciding on who to put on the nominating committee? And furthermore, how will you ensure that the nominating committee, despite having 3 police officers on it, promotes an independent police oversight board?
You know, I'm going to communicate to the officers involved what I would always communicate, that, you know, I expect them to be, you know, people of integrity, to follow the rules, to stay in their lane, to understand, you know, what is trying to be accomplished here, regardless of our personal feeling one way or the other, that they maintain a level of neutrality and professionalism in their recommendation. I think it's important that we do have a law enforcement voice on the as this commission becomes formed. I do think it's important to have that perspective shared. I'm a big believer in having what I like to say is the entire conversation, and to eliminate law enforcement from that, I think would not be in the best interest of the council or the committee as it comes together, as well as its legitimacy going forward. So
I have, and I appreciate your candor and the way with which you responded to Councilor Kuyama Lane's experience and sharing about that, the way that you acknowledge that history and the fact that there are changes that need to be made, I think meant a lot to me and to a lot of the people listening. So I appreciate your willingness and humility in that, because I think that can be hard to do sometimes, and I think that's a sign of good leadership. I'm just curious what your commitment is to ensuring that call reallocation process actually happens, so that we're having a data-driven approach to ensuring that we have the right number of officers on staff, and that we're taking a data-driven approach first before saying, we need more staff, because the reality is that across all bureaus, there's going to be pain points. This is something that I'm not taking lightly. There's going to be a lot of, we talked about monuments that are going to be closing, just yesterday or the day before during our council session. And we're going to need your cooperation with the call reallocation process and assigning officers to work on that process. Is that something that you're committed to as we answer those hard questions as a council about how many officers we need on staff and who is the appropriate responder for each 911 call?
I made the call to Bob Causey early last year and asked him to begin this process. So it would be disingenuous to have started something and not demonstrate ongoing support to it. So I'm very, very supportive of it. As I mentioned earlier, policing has evolved in a way that is really remarkable as we look at, what is the role of law enforcement in a community and what are the calls that, police need to go to. Portland Police Bureau was one of the first, when I was handed the instructions to start the behavioral health unit in, 2012, 2013, something to that effect, we looked around the country, there was only one or two that we could find that had clinicians embedded with their police officers. We now have 5, and our behavioral health unit is a national model. We're the first agency in the country to go to all crisis intervention team training, and then we developed enhanced crisis intervention team training. So, I'm really proud of the history of the Police Bureau and of the city to be progressive in its thinking around law enforcement. And I think this alternative response is there, as well as how we utilize the system, the 911 system, to identify what calls officers go to. I would caution council, though, that is a study and it's happening and it needs to happen, and I will be supportive, including dedicating resources to it as available. But also know that I will continue to message that we are at an all-time low of staff. And if we are going to make changes to a system, and that's what we rely upon right now, the 911 system, then we need to have those alternatives in place. And my concern, particularly going into the next couple of budget cycles, is that, we can't stop and wait to see what that's going to look like, that we have to continue to hire, we have to continue to fund the Police Bureau while we look for that. And I think the goal, this aspirational goal, which I think exists, I really believe exists, that someday we could have smaller police departments and more civilian responses or non-armed responses. I believe that exists. I think it's smarter financially. I don't think they need to go to all these calls, and a lot of cops, frankly, don't want to go to them. But I don't think that's a year out. I think that dream is 3 to 5 to 10 years out. The problem is in real time right now, people are calling 911, and I haven't looked lately, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's 20, 30, 40 calls holding right now, and we're operating at a shortage. So it's a matter of, that flexibility and being able to build a plane while we're flying, and I hope that we're able to get there. But in terms of specifics right now, this call study and this review, absolutely. I'm excited to see where it comes and what we learn from it. There is an enforcement component to this conversation. It's an uncomfortable one, but there is an enforcement component to this conversation. And I say that, we are a nation of laws, and those laws have not always been applied fairly. I think I've recognized that. But laws provide a level of predictability and a level of certainty for our community. And when we grant exceptions for the obedience to certain laws, that begins some of the breakdown, in my opinion, of the overall sense of community and the overall sense of safety, even if the threat might be lower than what's anticipated or what's perceived. And so making sure that we take a systems approach, recognizing that it's a complex issue, it's not complicated, it's actually complex, and that it has to have advocacy, it has to have outreach, it has to have services, it has to have a place for people to go, but there also has to be a component, an enforcement component to that for when we get to a place of resistance where that's no longer where they no longer want to participate in whatever that system has created. I think the struggle we have is, of course, identifying what's the right one. I do not believe that entering people into the criminal justice system is the answer, but as we heard in that meeting, there were a number of people, and I have experienced this personally, testified in that meeting that jail saved their life. And that was the wording they used, jail saved their life. And I know that that is a third wheel, a third rail to touch in a lot of communities, but I've spent enough time with enough people to know that some folks needed somebody to step in and hold them accountable and tell them, no, this is your option, this is your choice. I think it's a horrible use of the criminal justice system. I want to be clear about that. I think it's absolutely unacceptable that our county jail is our largest mental health institution. But that's because these other systems have failed. And these other systems have just said, well, we'll turn it over to the police. And as we talked about in that meeting, you know, we're the tip of the spear. So I think a systems approach means law enforcement has to be at the table. Outreach has to be at the table. Services have to be at the table. Shelter has to be at the table. It's looking at all of it from start to finish. And then looking at, you know, what's that role, what's that role, what's that role, how do they support one another? We haven't done that because it's awkward because there's a lot of people that are in one or the other and they don't necessarily want to see the whole thing. And that's what I was trying to convey.
And I'm going to pose a hypothetical situation and a hypothetical solution, and you tell me if the hypothetical situation actually exists and if you think my hypothetical solution is crazy. The hypothetical situation is, suppose there's a group of crimes that have already been done, not crimes in progress, where police respond to calls about that crime. They go out there to the victim, but then nobody ever investigates it because there aren't any investigators. Is it possible that it would actually be more effective to say, you know what? We're not going to respond to 80% of those calls at all, but we will respond to 20%, and by freeing up time from responding to calls nothing will happen with, we'll be able to add some more detectives to actually investigate that 20%.
How do we have that hypothetical conversation with the community? Because we're basically going to tell people, no, we're not coming. Your car just got broken into, we're not coming. This happened, we're not coming. We are doing these things. We have looked at, I gave TC Jovic a task when I first came on board. We haven't implemented this because it's not too far off, but we have looked at a high priority call response model. How do we take what little bit of resources we have and really focus on that? But already, you know, we're looking at 3, 4, 5 hour wait times for that person whose home's been burglarized. Now we're going to tell them, forget it, we're just throwing in the towel. I mean, it's a tough conversation to have, but I welcome it with our, you know, with our leadership, with our community.
I really appreciate that answer, and I should make it clear that I think that this council and the mayor would have to take leadership in having that conversation with the community. We wouldn't leave it to you. But if we asked you to do that, it would be up to us to go to the community, or probably go to the community first and say, what do you think about this? Should we stop responding to a lot of calls so we can investigate some calls? So thank you for that answer.
I don't want to suggest to anybody here or anybody that's listening that these are easy solutions. They're expensive and they're difficult. And I'm not even convinced it's the best system, but it's the one we've built and relied upon for the last umpteen decades or years. And if we're going to change it, I don't see an opportunity to change it and not continue to support what we have, because if we take away what we have and try to change it, I think we're going to see an increase in crime and problems. So it is very frustrating.
What did you learn from the outside, or what do you think the Bureau maybe has learned about crowd control from the experience in 2020? And I want to specifically note and ask if you've had the chance to read the Citizen Review Committee's report, one of the authors of which is on our council, and if you have thoughts on that proposed approach and their documentation.
2020 and 21, really unprecedented in many ways, nationally and in policing, but no more so than here in the city of Portland. I mean, we were the national story around how we showed up and how we, being the police bureau, how we, being the community. I think the lessons learned during that time period have made us now one of the premier agencies. We've been very transparent in our journey and lessons learned and things that we could have done better, as well as things we need to be proud of. I never ever want to characterize that time as a complete failure on the part of the Portland Police Bureau. The men and women of the Police Bureau were put into an impossible situation, and clearly there were mistakes made, and we've identified those. The outside independent report identified those. We have taken steps to rectify and do better. But I am immensely proud of the men and women who put the time in night after night, day after day, and not just on the line, organizationally, our sworn staff, our non-sworn staff. We had civilians trapped in our building. They couldn't get out, but they came to work every day, and they showed up, and they processed reports, and they processed evidence. And so there were a lot of good things that happened during that time period from a policing standpoint, things that were done well in really exceptional circumstances. So I believe that, the steps we've taken even in the last year, our joint training with the Oregon State Police, our certification with DPSST around crowd control, we've come a long, long ways since 2020. And from a community standpoint, frankly, I think a lot of people are appreciating that. They're seeing that in our crowd response, at least in the conversations I'm having with people who are involved in First Amendment activities. I'm hearing that and seeing that they understand that there's a different tone, there's a different expectation. I think we're going to see more events, and it's going to require all of us, the leadership of this council, the leadership of the mayor and the city administrator, the county, the state. It's going to require all of us to continue to message, how does Portland want to show up?
It's a national strategy of white nationalist extremist groups to infiltrate law enforcement. Can you explain your policy personally and approach to PPB, on PPB involvement with groups like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, et cetera, and what accountability looks like should you learn that one of your officers is involved with such a group, as has happened in the further back past?
Yeah, we have very broad policies that really restrict behavior and association with other groups, in terms of who you can be a part of and who you cannot. But I want to emphasize, and I agree with you, and I've read the studies and seen the reports, and don't doubt the fact that there is an effort by white nationalists to try and, attract themselves to paramilitary organizations, et cetera, et cetera. But our process is intended to weed out extremes on any end. It doesn't have to be just there. It could be, we don't want people that are extremes in any of these places. We want to have a heightened sensitivity because of the intentionality about what we've read and what we've learned. But our personnel division and the process we go through to hire people is really very intentional, very detailed. We're relying upon the information that's shared with us, but we go out and make sure we do our best and do our due diligence and hold them accountable, which in my opinion, would be, doing an investigation and trying to make a determination, is there a violation of policy there?
I'm very proud, I'm very enthusiastic after listening to you this evening, and I first became aware of you through the Red Door Project, where many, many years ago I attended one of the performances at the Armory where you were trying to really bridge the gaps in understanding each other, and I knew at that moment you were a special person, and I really appreciate you coming back out of retirement to serve. I thank you for your transparency, your candor, your leadership, and I'm very confident that you are going to pull us into the future, make us one of the most progressive police forces in the country, and I appreciate that. And with that, Madam President, I'd like to call the question.
It is a little disappointing to see the same three folks brought up to the same three positions. But again, I want to note I'm not inclined to make a point out of that in any one of them. And my vote is based solely on this nomination. I'm going to vote yes. And it may be surprising to some who have asked me to use this as a vehicle for broader concerns with PPB. I don't believe that would be the effect of a no vote, nor do I think that's an appropriate use of a vote on this resolution. I think the people who have asked to prevent Chief Day from continuing in this role for that reason would be disappointed in what the outcome of that would look like. I do have significant concerns about some of the things I heard today, and I want to note those in terms of the First Amendment and police responses to peaceful protests, the use of overtime in November, which is an overtime greater than the entire budget of our primary crime prevention program, the entire annual budget to respond to election-related protests. The idea that the both sidesism of that response on the white nationalist question is equating the axe to the tree trunk as it relates to white nationalists infiltrating police forces. And I have these concerns not because of how the Police Bureau views these issues, but because of how the communities who have given me their input over the last several years have viewed it. I know that you, Chief, are a fan of James Baldwin, so I think you'll appreciate if one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, the judges, or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected, those precisely who need the law's protection most, and listens to their testimony. And so I want to stress that I won't be abandoning those concerns with this vote. I want to continue reaching out to the unprotected and listening to that testimony. But I've also come to the conclusion that as it relates to this moment, Chief Day is likelier than not to be supportive of some of the really important culture change work that we need to do at PPB, and likelier than not to engage in conversation about the items I mentioned earlier from the perspective of respectful dialogue and possibly disagreement in the hopes of changing practices and improving outcomes. And I think the best example of that is your work on the call allocation process. This is the process by which we've seen you be willing to do things differently and going to contribute to resolving several issues, including PSR, reduction of use of force, clarity of roles among first responders, and overtime costs. And it's not just you, Chief, it's obviously DCA Myers, Director Kazi, Chief Gillespie. There's so many others working on it. And I do want to note that the full reallocation may take years, but we do have other responders available now, including PSR, Community Health Assess and Treat, Parks Rangers, and PS3s. So in conclusion, our votes don't necessarily reflect our views on each and every action the Police Bureau takes, but rather on whether or not Chief Day should remain as chief. And so given that, I vote yes.
Councillor Canal really said everything that I wanted to say with such clarity that I won't repeat it. I will say I share those same concerns, and I look forward to working with you to address those concerns and make sure that we're serving Portland as well as we can, and I vote aye.
I think Portland has the most progressive police force that I've ever encountered, and I think you're a product of it, and I am excited for you to lead it into its next chapter and put your stamp on the chapters thereafter. And frankly, if you're a parent out there right now, or if you're a person in career transition, there's a thought that you will mimic the leadership of the early folks in which brought you into an organization. I'll tell you right now, to anybody in the public, like right now is the time to come into the Portland Police Force, because this is the type of leadership that we're looking for folks to lean into for a career. And as a member of the gay community, I'll just say, I feel very served by the progressiveness of the Portland Police Bureau, and that our experience in this community is different than it is in other cities. And while we have work to do in many facets, and every time you peel the onion, there's another way we can improve. I don't want it lost that there are some of us in the community who in other places are not as we're not as privileged as we are to be in Portland. And so Portland is a mecca for my community in a lot of ways, and it is related to our relationship with the Portland Police Bureau. So thank you for being here at this time. Thank you for coming back. I vote aye.